Welcome to the True Story London podcast. I'm Michelle Toth. In this podcast, we listen to a true personal story told live at one of our shows in London, followed by a conversation with the storyteller about their background, process, story themes, and more. Today's storyteller is Ezio de Mauro, sharing how and why he kept his colorblindness a secret for over 30 years. Ezio is an entertaining and compelling storyteller who manages to convey both the funny and poignant nature of his unusual situation. In our chat afterward, we delve deeper into the topics of shame, acceptance, difference, and inclusion. But first, let's listen to Ezio's story recorded live at 21 Soho.
So I was 6 when I found out I had a disease. I was at school. I was drawing some trees, and a classmate started laughing at me. Something about green and orange and brown using the wrong places. I stood up for myself and I started saying, hey, I know that leaves are green, apricots are orange, tree bark is brown. But then other kids just joined in, started laughing as well, and I froze. I didn't quite know what happened, but I didn't want this to happen ever again. So the following day, I went to a stationery shop and I bought myself colored pencils with the name of the color on them. And I thought, this is fixed. Never going to have a problem with colors ever again. But I was wrong. The following day, completely out of the blue, my mom just asked me, Ezio, do you have problems telling colors apart? And I froze again. I was like, shit, the teacher, she's a snitch. I just immediately had that thought. And she continued. And she said, I'm asking this because there is a disease like that. Shit! I froze again. And I thought, I'm diseased. I have a disease. So I was like, oh my God, cannot possibly say anything about this. And so he just said, in the most natural possible way, no, everything is fine. And I just walked away. But inside, I was really, really freaking out. And I was thinking, I'm diseased. I lied about it. I must keep it secret forever. And so I did. For 30 years, I pretended to be color-sighted, and I always keep my color blindness hidden. And speaking of secrets, the other interesting thing is that I was coming to terms with being gay, and I was raised by a fairly traditional Italian family. So I knew that at some stage coming out was going to be a reasonably dramatic big deal. And it was. Exactly as you're imagining it now. However, that was not a big deal to me. I said, I got this. I am going to come out to my parents. I have this. It's absolutely fine. And, when I did, I managed it. But there was no way on earth I would ever come out as colorblind. Like, that was just not going to happen. So I developed my coping mechanisms over 30 years, just deflecting conversations about colors, just blending in. In the 90s, I even became a web developer working full-time with colors. I'm not going to tell you how I did it, but that was quite something. I just felt like I infiltrated this color-seeing world. There were so many near misses that almost outed me as a colorblind. I was about 12. I was with many cousins of mine because Italian family, so big family, obviously. And they were reading an encyclopedia because we didn't have TikTok back then. So that's what you do. This was about the human body. And I was like, okay. Vision. Oh, shit, this is going to be dodgy. As they were reading, I actually learned 2 things. One is that my disease was called color blindness, and it was a thing. I was like, oh, I'm diseased. It's a thing. It's color blindness. The other is Ishihara plates, which, I don't know if you know, they're colored patterns in which color-sighted people get to see numbers. Colorblind people, like me, get to see nothing. And so my cousin started reading the numbers in turn, because it was fun. It was nice. It was a game. There was 30, 34, 46, 39. I was like, shit, there's nothing I can read here. And soon it was going to be my turn. So I had to come up with something. And I just said, hey, let's all sing in unison. It's going to be fun. Luckily, they all agreed, and we started singing the numbers in unison. Well, they sang the numbers in unison. I was just miming. And I got away with it. Fast forward a few years. I was 18, driving license time. I was a great driver, just like many Italian people. I was a rogue driver. I was just Great. Self-defined myself as a great driver. And the test was not a problem. Driving was great. Theory, no problem at all. I knew that there was going to be a sort of a medical happening. And I was expecting that somebody's going to bring up color blindness. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. I just stressed for months because I knew that somebody was going to ask me if I was colorblind. Now, the normal thing to do would have been ask your instructor and check if you can drive as a colorblind person, because actually you can. I didn't, because I didn't want to expose myself as diseased. I couldn't do any research because there was no internet, and so going to a library, asking questions would have meant that I would have to disclose my condition. So I didn't say anything. I just decided to stress about it for months and months and months. The day comes, surely enough, they go through a number of medical questions about, health and so on and so forth, and they ask me if I'm colorblind. And on a whim, I just said no. However, as I say no, I start having this train of thought, which is like, oh my God, maybe I'm going to get my driving license. Maybe they're going to cancel it later, whatever happens. And I didn't hear that they kept on asking me questions. And so I said, can you repeat, please? And the next question they asked me was, are you hard of hearing? And I was like, shit, I'm not going to get my driving license because I'm deaf. I mean, seriously? So many situations like this. And yes, I did get my driving license. Everything changed when I was 36. I was at my grandma's. I really, really loved my grandmother. And I used to go and see her as often as I could, especially after my grandfather passed away. And she knew how fond I was of loquats. It's a Mediterranean fruit. Well, it's actually Chinese. That's cultural appropriation. It's Mediterranean, we say. It's a beautiful fruit. If you've never seen it or tasted it, recommend it. She knew how fond I was of it, and she had a tree in her orchard. And so she said, let's go and pick some. You're tall, you can reach out, and then I'll collect them. Sure, let's go. And as I start picking the fruit from the trees, she just starts saying, no, not this one. That one. No, not that one. This one. The one next to it. Jesus, you're just like your grandfather. I had to direct him every time we were picking loquats because he couldn't choose the ripe ones. But I'm very disappointed in you, Ezio. Your grandfather only went to school for 2 years, and he did not learn colors. But you went to university, and you have a degree, and after all this time and all this money, you still didn't learn colors? That's very disappointing. And I was like, I just melted after I heard her self-explaining how her late husband was colorblind. That was the explanation I didn't know I needed. Like kind of closure. Understanding where I got colorblindness from. That changed everything. And so I stopped seeing myself as diseased, as different. I literally pivoted from closeted colorblind to next time I'll just say it. And so I did. So as soon as friends started mentioning things like the beige building, I was like, the hell is beige? Seriously, color-sighted people. Most of them were absolutely mind-blown. They had no idea that I was colorblind. Same thing at work. Every time I saw like charts and color schemes and weird things that did not make any sense to me, instead of just wasting hours and choosing a color picker from Photoshop, whatever it was, to figure out what color that was, I said that I was colorblind. And in fact, I even started providing feedback so that people would come up with color schemes that were easier to read for us colorblind people. I've always loved stripes and bold colors. And I started wearing them unapologetically, which is why you see me here looking like a deck chair. Proud of it. And finally, the big one, I told my parents as well. And that was the closure, the right closure moment. My mom was blown away. She had no idea that her father was colorblind. I never had the heart, however, to go back to that conversation of many, many years ago. There is a disease like that. Because I don't think it was fair on them. They said it because they loved me. They said it because they wanted to help me. But since it took me 30 years and some weirdly colored fruit to fix this, I thought that, if there is one thing that is worth remembering out of this story is that if you talk to kids about being different, maybe about being unique, rather, talk to them about this at large. But do it like it's 2022. Don't do it like it's 1979, for fuck's sake, please. Thank you.
Ezio, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here.
It's so great to see you.
Likewise.
How does it sound hearing that story back after such a long time? I think it's been like almost 2 years.
Yes, it's been a long time. It felt a bit like an out-of-body experience in a good way, I have to say, because hearing back my voice, I could actually tell the emotion. And one of my fears of telling the story was this would sound like a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation rather. I could hear the emotion, and I'm happy it came through.
It was fantastically told. It did not sound like a boring work presentation at all. Did you find yourself kind of reliving those moments?
Yeah, absolutely.
What was that like?
It's interesting now because it's something I've processed. So it's such a peaceful kind of experience. It's not unsettling anymore. So I can see the fun of it. I can see how, everything turns out to be just fine. And so it's something I enjoy telling people now. If you'd asked me a few years ago, probably would have been like, oh my God, this is still a bit traumatic. I'm still so uncomfortable when I tell people I'm colorblind and something. And now it makes me smile, genuinely.
It made everyone smile. I love the part about coming out as colorblind being more difficult than coming out as gay to your strict, presumably Catholic Italian family.
Yeah. We're not strict in the sense of like traditional Catholic strictness. It's the background in Italy. You just absorb whatever society is like. And of course, there is a certain number of norms, and you're going to get married, you're going to have kids, and this is what's set for you, basically. So they were not particularly strict in the sense of religion, but there was an expectation. And, for me to know that at some stage I would have had to break that expectation and tell them, I'm not going to marry a woman. I might have kids, maybe not, but it's not going to be the traditional way you have in mind.
Did the presence of the colorblindness, which was so much more significant to you in terms of secret and shame, did that in any way make coming out to your family easier?
No, it was just two processes in parallel, I would say. So for me, coming out was much more rational. It was like, hey, this is who I am. I don't think they're quite ready yet to know, because of, always cultural norms and everything. As soon as I get a hint that they're ready, I'll tell them. It didn't feel daunting. It felt like this is not the right time. Whereas the colorblindness was just like, oh, no, this is something about me that I really don't want people to know about. I'd never felt that being gay was something I should be ashamed of. It was just something like, yeah, maybe you don't need to know now. But colorblindness was such a stigma for me that I cannot even quite tell you rationally why.
I know, it doesn't sound rational.
Yeah, it's not rational.
And I'm laughing near you, not at you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm doing exactly the same thing. Re-seeing the story there, which is why at the end I in a way, kind of encourage adults to talk to kids about being different in a context in which it's like, hey, everybody has something like this. So don't worry, own it.
And it's true. People do have something. But I know you, Ezio, and I know you to be an incredibly intelligent, thoughtful, analytical person. So how did you go for 30 years without investigating the relative seriousness or lack of seriousness of colorblindness as a quote unquote disease? That's something that you kept in for such a long time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the first part of the whole thing is genuinely lack of information and lack of knowing what this is, And I think that a lot of people with some form of diversity go through that. I'm the only one. I cannot ask if somebody is like me because that would mean exposing myself. And we didn't have the internet. And because I didn't exactly know what to look for, I couldn't go to a library and say, tell me about colorblindness, because it didn't have a name. It didn't have a name for me. I didn't know how to do it. This was in the beginning. And then, of course, as things became more available, like the internet and so on and so forth, I did start to do my research and I did start finding, more about it. But it still was not normalized for me. It still was, this is something I shouldn't disclose. And so, yes, I surely knew about it by the time I started working, started going to high school and so on and so forth. But it was still too much for me to disclose. I just couldn't.
Just felt too vulnerable.
Yes, and too strange and weird because I didn't know anyone else who was colorblind. It was something that I heard that some people, certain percentages of the population might have. It's funny how we talk about this for much bigger and serious things like representation. There was no representation. Like, I had no idea that Paul Newman was colorblind, for instance.
It's still not something that is talked about very much. Yeah. I think perhaps because it's just accepted as a characteristic that doesn't have to impair people too much at all. And maybe that's why it doesn't get any attention. But It's a fascinating part of your story.
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me why we come full circle with finding out about your grandfather. That really seemed to normalize it for you.
Absolutely, yes. Just, okay, this is what I have, who I am, whatever. And this is how it came to be. I cannot even tell you why, but it was so important for me to know. And I didn't know that I need that. Otherwise, probably I would have done some family history research or something. I just didn't know I needed that closure. I believe at some stage in the story, I say explicitly, I chose to stress about this for months. And that kind of comforting element came from figuring out where I got it from.
That's exactly what I noted to myself, too, when you said that part of the story. Other than saying it out loud to even one person, you chose for months to stress about it. But from this constraint, this self-imposed constraint that you weren't going to reveal this to anyone, came a lot of ingenious activity.
Oh, yes.
Like you gave us probably just a fraction of the examples of how you had to dance around this issue or chose to dance around this issue, which struck me as very creative. Was the creativity and ingenuity, cleverness, was that there for you and then you just applied it? Or do you think that some of this hiding forced you to come up with ways of solving these perceived problems?
I guess probably the second, if I was to guess. Because, once I read, and I forgot the source, but it was very enlightening to me, like that creativity comes because of constraints. Like you have something you need to work with, and then all of a sudden you become creative. And I think that that's what triggered it. Like I don't see myself as a particularly creative person, but at the same time, figuring out all the ways that I was skirting around colors and stuff like that, I think, oh, wow, no, that was like thinking on the spot and coming up with a very quick strategy to deflect the conversation and not say anything about colors or stuff like that. So I think knowing that I had something, that I had a disease, as I was saying when I was a kid, made me creative.
Wow. Okay. So the choice to become a web developer.
Yeah.
So like putting yourself in the fire, like what was the thinking there?
I don't know what I was thinking. It was the beginning of the internet. I'm a nerd. I'm a geek. Technology was like exceedingly interesting. And I just had this opportunity to work for this. Nowadays, a web agency probably wouldn't even exist. Back then, it was just a company that would make websites for you. The bottom line is you had to do everything. Like you were not in a team of specialists and you had a visual designer, you had a UX expert, you had a system administrator, you were everything. And I was everything. So I was everything from the person who sets up the servers to the person who comes up with the HTML, the language used to describe the page, and the person who was figuring out the visuals. And it was not an opt-in situation. It's just like, okay, if you want to work in technology, you have to do the whole thing because there's no other option.
We're all generalists here. So that's interesting. So kind of tech first, but this came along with it.
Yeah, this came along with it. And it's just like technology was just so interesting. So I basically developed this persona who was very exacting, who was very precise. I was very customer focused. And so I was like, no, I'm not going to choose colors. I'm going to let my customer choose colors for me. And I'm going to let my customer give me the exact numbers that represent these colors. And I just want to do it to their specifications exactly. I mean, this was my mantra all the time. And I was telling this to everybody at the cost of sounding really, really, really pedantic, which I wasn't. I was trying to be very accommodating. But when it came to that, I was just like, oh, no. I will let my customers choose.
See, that's another clever way to frame a situation and address this perceived shortcoming. But what I love about you is you have this, I guess it's color vision deficiency, technically. And you are someone who expresses yourself in color.
Yes.
I love that, like, juxtaposition. Yes. Like, you look fantastic. That's a great jumper and the socks. And it's great.
Yeah. That's another thing that sometimes people notice how I like to, like, match my socks and my T-shirt. But
yeah, and that's not something everyone does, color-sighted or not.
No, I think you're right. And again, I wish I knew the source, but I believe that there are some painters and photographers who are colorblind and, like, they choose to emphasize that in their work. And so they paint things in a way that might sound weird to you, but it sounds particularly appealing to somebody who's colorblind. And it's just like, oh, I will never know how you see it, but this is how I see it.
I love that. Like, I'd like to come back to that, the idea of making the world more accessible to more people. But before we go too far away from the idea of colorblindness making you more resourceful, creative problem solver, there's a pattern I think I've noticed in my friends who are also gay, who you grow up in the time frame that you and I did, and there's a reality for folks who are really needing to pay attention to the world around them.
Yes.
And it creates this observational habit and seeing and sensing what is happening at all times.
Yeah.
And life just doesn't come to you. You analyze it. You're like, I feel like that makes people so effective in so many different situations. You know, I don't think that being hypervigilant, I wouldn't characterize it as a gift, but like maybe the silver lining of that reality ends up being something that you really can put to good use as a, you know, as a professional, but also in your personal life, like just being able to read people, read situations. Do you see them contributing to your success and your effectiveness at work or in life?
You know what? Now that you mention it, I believe it plays a part, but it's thanks to this conversation, because I wouldn't have seen it that way. But you're right. And this actually makes me think about it, because being gay, right, and not necessarily being out means that you control even little things like, are you looking at men and women in equal amount to make sure that you're not perceived as just looking at men or mostly looking at men? What that does to you is that you just become observational, and you just really become able to like pick up traits and pick up behaviors in a way that is genuinely like more general, I would suppose. And you're right, this translates into work. I happen to also manage people at work, and sometimes just being able to understand the vibe of that conversation, if there is maybe a topic that we should glide over now or maybe talk about later, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's just the unspoken things that you notice. And now that you mention it, yes, I think it plays a part in sort of becoming, you know, more well-rounded as a professional.
I just think that's interesting that you had two versions of uniqueness or difference to the majority that would have worked on different angles of how you approached any given problem, situation, person, group. I know that being an American in Britain, that's like a small version of it where I'm just aware that I just default think about things differently. And I don't have the same assumptions. I definitely don't have the same upbringing. And I could just move through the world not paying attention to that, not being aware of that difference. But if you are aware of it, you're kind of in learning mode all the time.
Totally.
Then if you perceive or frame learning mode as a good thing, instead of like, I'm different or I don't know already how people are going to think about this thing or react to that, then it becomes kind of fun, kind of like an interesting game of living. But it's too easy to, and understandably so, to perceive certain difference or uniqueness as a negative and something you're working from a deficit. Yeah,
you're so right. This brings me to another big enlightening of mine, which is the Italian upbringing in a Catholic context in which everything is either right or wrong, black or white, this or that. And I had a very similar experience to yours, living abroad. Like the first place where I spent a significant amount of time outside of Italy was Australia. So it couldn't be more different. Language, culture, geographical position. And there was so much that in my mind at first was, this is not right, this is wrong, this is not right, this is wrong, just because it was different. Mm-hmm. And I think that really helped as well, to just say, no, this is just different. This is not wrong. It's just another way to look at things.
And what's an example of that? Was it like shrimp on the Barbie, or was it like, you know, more cultural?
It was absolutely shrimp on the Barbie. It was things like, you know, shop opening hours, like the most stupid things, you know. Some of the things I hold on to now, maybe a little bit more, because I kind of own them as a cultural thing in Italy. Like going into places, apartments, they did not have a dining table. And to me, it was just like,
really?
Yes.
Wait, what did they do?
Well, first of all, flat shares are much more common in Australia. Like in Italy, flat shares are not a thing because, well, I'm talking about the 90s, because you live with your family. I don't, you know, chances are you're in a flat share. The living room is not a place where people go and eat. It's probably just a place where they socialize and spend some time together. So there is a technical reason why there's no dining table there, because you want to maximize the space for socializing. But immediately played out like, oh, this is wrong. How can you possibly have a meal and not have a dining table? What do you mean? You know,
truly offending the Italian sensibility.
Oh my goodness, yes, truly offending my sensibility. I think traveling and going somewhere else that was not my home just did the whole work for me. And again, I recognize that some people might come out of it in a different way, like, oh no, this is totally wrong. I want to go home and I never want to travel or experience the world again. For me, it did exactly the opposite. And it was interesting because as a younger person, I was also less introverted. I was more willing to put myself out there and just go to a bar or a pub and say hi to people and have conversation, things that I wouldn't do now.
Really?
Yeah, we all wear different hats, right? And so, especially when it comes to work, I think it's very, very important to not be that person who signals that, oh, leave me alone, do not interact with me. We live in especially our work culture is much more, no, ask me questions. And so, yeah, it costs energy. That's how I usually like to express it. It's just something I can totally do. And it's enjoyable. It just costs energy. So at the end of the day, you just really want to go home in darkness and silence, as I often joke with my friends, and just say, no, this is my recovery time. And I think that also was important. Was like when I was younger, I was thinking, let's go out there, talk to people, meet people. Learning English was another important reason for me to do it. And yeah, I think that's when I started like shedding that mindset of shame and being different is being wrong kind of thing.
On the one hand, I wish that could happen earlier for more people, because as you get older, you realize like wrinkles or not, you would never go back.
Yeah.
like never go back, because you feel so much better letting go of other people's expectations and establishing your own. Makes such a difference in quality of daily life.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
So Ezio, can we talk about your experience of crafting the story? Like, first of all, finding the story.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I remember we were in a workshop together.
And
you're like,
together.
I don't have any stories.
Yes. I joined just purely out of curiosity because, again, my goal was I want to hear other people's story because it's fascinating and it's interesting. And I don't even quite remember because, again, sometimes creativity is something that just happens and it just bubbles up. And all of a sudden I thought, you know what, there's this thing about myself that is pretty weird, funny, strange, silly, all that kind of mix that as you were telling us what is good storytelling and as you were telling us what the elements of a good story are, I was thinking, tick, 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 tick. There are a number of things here that happen, the peaks and the valleys, the beginning, the end, the struggle, all the elements you were telling us about. And I thought, maybe this could be a story, but I definitely did not join the workshop thinking that I had a story.
Yeah. And then you just told us about that part of your childhood. It was so funny and interesting. And I remember it was like, it sparked other people's.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wait, I have a story about growing up.
Yes, and I remember that moment.
That's why I always say and believe that everyone has a story because everyone has lived.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of deciding like, what part of my life do I want to focus on? So you chose this one. And then how was it as you put the story together? Because you really did a lovely job of crafting it.
It was very interesting because I'm a very slow writer. Like when I write 3-line email, it probably takes me like 2 hours to get it right because I keep on revisiting it. And what I did differently or tried to do differently was, hey, don't dwell too much in it. Just write it down and ask for feedback sooner rather than later. And you offered to just listen to the story and give me feedback, adjust things. And also you helped me with like the timing because, it's something you need to do within a certain amount of time. I think one big difference was, hey, I know the story. It's my story. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to sort of engineer it. It's my story. So that made it easier. And also, asking for feedback earlier as opposed to waiting for it to be perfect.
What you just described is something I've noticed with lots of people. Like they start out, they really know the story because they lived it.
Yes.
Then they write it down and get in their head.
Yes.
And they move away from their knowing.
Yeah.
And now it's like a complicated mess.
Yes.
And then to get back to the knowing, like get back to like, oh, I lived this. I don't have to craft it.
Yes.
I have to just share it.
Yes.
That telling a story from you versus trying to get the other person to get it. Because that's what happens when it becomes like wordy or they put it on the page. It gets really long. They get all, concerned about how someone's going to hear it. They almost want to control the other person's experience of it. Yeah. And I'm always trying to coach people like speak your truth and trust that if you speak like you did with the emotion and telling us the little anecdotes and making it visual so we can picture what was going on, that people will get it. If they don't get it, that's okay. It'll probably spark a conversation that will allow someone to like further explore like the themes or your experience.
Yeah.
And there's also just that element that once you do put something out in the world, it actually is no longer yours. Like the person receiving it gets to experience it the way that they're ready to.
Yeah.
So some of those things come up a lot.
It totally makes sense.
In this kind of personal storytelling.
I think another piece of advice that you gave everyone in the workshop earlier on was the beginning. Figure out how you want to begin the story and start with a sentence or something that has intention and not just, oh, let me tell you about a story when I was 6, that kind of thing. Just start with something that has intention and just project somebody immediately into the story. I think that was such great advice as well, because it really changes everything from, oh, I'm reading a book and this is the beginning, this is the scene setting, to bam, there you are.
Yeah. Being super deliberate with that opening line or lines is It's so important. And it's important for a few different reasons, because it lets your audience know a lot of information about what's coming.
Yeah.
And then they can settle down.
Yeah.
It also can settle you down because you know what you're going to say.
Yes.
And so, that can be like the one thing you memorize, or that plus your ending.
Yes.
Because it grounds you,
That's
which is really good. But most important, what you can do with your opening line is spark curiosity.
Yes.
All those human brains that you're trying to connect with,
Yeah.
get them to perk up and listen. So it's like a really interesting choice. An opening sentence can foretell what's coming. It can summarize a story in a sentence. It can ask a question or pose a question that gets people wanting to know the answer, put a puzzle out there that people want to know the solution to, etc. There's so many things you can do. Yeah, and your opening line was terrific. Did you also know your closing line?
No, I think I had to work on it a little bit. I wanted to end with a laugh kind of thing. I didn't want it to sound like, oh my God, this was just an intense labor of psychological stress and everything. I basically wanted to convey this meaning of it's great. Ultimately we humans, hopefully most of the times we end up being all right. But I also, in a way, tried to say, hey, do you know what? My purpose here is that, talk to your kids about diversity and let them know. And just, and I swear a lot because I'm Italian. And so I said, I need to end with a swear word.
In general, I discourage people from being moralistic, like telling people this is what you should take away.
Yeah.
But I think this was a noteworthy exception because those language choices really matter.
They do. Yeah, I think you're right. That's the risk that sometimes you can say, oh, let me educate you, let me teach you, let me tell you. Hopefully the intent there is, no, I've been there. So it's not a third-party experience read from a book. It's just like from the perspective of somebody who experienced something, then here's what I've learned and here's what I would do different if I had the chance to talk to a kid about diversity or something like that.
Absolutely. And coming back to the topic of accessibility and how the world, the work world, the whole world can make itself more accessible for colorblind people or people with color vision deficiency. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, first-hand experience is to disclose that you're colorblind and having people wanting to understand, to empathize from your point of view and saying, is this color scheme good for you and so on. First of all, it's heartwarming, like somebody cares about who I am and how I perceive the world. And then I think what it does to you also, it makes you want to pay it forward in a way and say, right, the work I'm going to do from now on, I'm definitely going to try and incorporate the same element. We're talking about the hearing, for instance. We're often in conference rooms and stuff like that. Even the little gestures, like you take the microphone and you put it slightly closer to the person who's talking. I think it's all give and take. That really helps because, somebody else on the other end of the line, maybe they're not hearing impaired or anything, but it would benefit if you do this little thing. So it could be day-to-day gestures. It could be like, thinking about interfaces and things that we do in IT and saying, hey, maybe this is not necessarily the most useful thing if you have difficulties typing. I'm saying this because my mom, unfortunately, as she's aging, her hands are starting to shake a little bit. She can no longer use mobile phones the way we have them. She can only use tablets. And I can see that in the way she interacts with devices, that like small interfaces and small things no longer work for her. What's interesting is that we're probably all going to go through that process. And society, mobile phones and everything, they were designed by people who are relatively able-bodied. Mm-hmm. And so it just really makes you think like, these designers are aging and these programmers are aging. Hopefully they will incorporate their learning about their body aging and their abilities changing into what they're doing. So there's a lot of thoughts that I usually...
Absolutely. So I love this idea that being aware of how much you value when people accommodate a little bit, that can make a big difference. And then you want to return that favor.
You want to return
and
that
be
favor.
That for other people.
Absolutely. And I think also showing that you're willing to listen helps a lot. Managing people often comes into there's a mechanical part of it, which is, we need to make reasonable adjustments for people who need them. You can think about it like, this is one of the boxes I need to tick. Fine. But the other is you can actually have a human conversation with the other person and say, hey, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've seen you struggling with, the size of the fonts on your screen. Is that just my perception or is it something we could work on? And these are all examples of things that happened throughout my career.
That is such good advice. Like if you can personalize a situation. So instead of it being one more thing we have to do, but rather it's like, there's a human being who needs bigger fonts or needs a different color scheme.
And finding the language is also very important because I think as society, we're trying to err on the side of caution because you might be afraid of offending somebody or you might be afraid of saying something wrong, which is true because you might genuinely offend people or say something wrong. So it's important. But at the same time, if you find the right words to approach somebody and say, hey, is it just me, or I saw you struggling with this? And is there anything we can do about it? I think you open a conversation that sounds very different. It could be like, oh, no, don't worry, I'm fine. It's just you. I'm totally fine. Versus, oh, now that you mentioned it, sure. Tell me more about your experience. Do we need to make it better?
I do agree with you. If you don't think in advance about a little bit about the language you're going to use, it does become very easy to offend.
Oh, yeah.
But there's probably like, a couple of elements to that. One is thinking about who you're talking to. Like, what do you know about that person?
Yeah.
And can you read any signals of their sensitivity or their openness? Another is just being broadly aware of language that's just more neutral and easier for most people to hear.
Yeah.
And then also like checking your belief that you can't recover from making a mistake.
Yeah.
Because if you believe that you cannot recover, that you have to get your communication perfect around these sort of sensitive topics, you'll stay silent and you won't learn, and you won't have the opportunity to do some of these things you're suggesting.
Yeah, it's important. Like, we should own it, and as you said, also we should own what happens if the conversation goes wrong. What can I do to signal my good intentions and still say I still want to learn from this.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I made an assumption. This is the assumption I made. This is where I come from, and I'm sorry that this is the wrong thing to do or say. I think it opens up a completely different conversation.
Oh, I love that. That's really good language if you need that recovery moment.
Yeah.
And the tone that you're using is very sincere. Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for making me think about it, because I'm aware that I need to do it more often myself, but saying it out loud helps you to stick to it.
Right?
Yeah.
I love it. And I've loved your story. It's been so fun to work on it with you, to hear it, and now to talk about it. So thank you so much for sharing. It's been really great.
Likewise, it's been great, both telling the story and sort of reflecting over it. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. For more information about today's storyteller and conversation, check out the show notes. The True Story London podcast is hosted by me, Michelle Toth. Our producer is Ellis Ballard. Our theme music is by Sea Noise. Live recordings were provided by Laughing Around and recorded at 21 Soho. More information about our live shows and workshops can be found at truestorylondon.com. And just one more thing. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help us to reach more people. Thanks, and we'll see you for another episode soon.